Now, I was just going to immediately start handing over to the guys, to the folk at this point, but I am going to mention one thing. I have really enjoyed all the talks today, but I particularly enjoyed James's lightning talk about resource utilization and containers and serverless, because they both potentially could massively improve that. And that's not just, as James said, about spending money, it's about the environment as well. So at the moment, we use about, the data center industry uses about 2% of the world's electricity. Very, very inefficiently. And that is going up fast because we know our industry is growing at an enormous rate. We cannot allow that to continue. We cannot allow ourselves to be burning fossil fuels, which, whether or not you agree with or believe in climate change, fossil fuels are still a limited resource for humanity. We are wasting them, and we don't need to. So serverless containers can both help with that. So what I'm going to do is now hand over to the folk on the panel who will introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what their perspective is on the serverless versus container question. Thank you very much. Kassandra.
Hi, I'm Kassandra. Most of you know me from, I think, like an hour ago when I give a talk. I work for IOPipe, so this is much more focused on where I work. We do AWS Lambda monitoring services, so if you don't like CloudWatch, check us out. We have a lot of perspective about containers versus serverless. Our CTO used to work for Docker, and we definitely have opinions on serverless versus containers, as our entire infrastructure also runs on serverless. So yeah. Oh, nice.
I'll pass it down. My name's Greg. I work for the Financial Times. You will have seen Ben's talk about our website and some of the bits and bobs there. That's not our only serverless example. We've got quite a few others. We also have some teams who are using Docker and containers. And at the moment, I'm an ex-server guy, actually. I used to, put servers into racks, configure SANs, all that sort of stuff. But now I'm very much in the serverless camp for its simplicity.
I'm Anna Doubková, as you probably know. I'm a huge fan of serverless, but at Pizzahut we don't really use serverless other than for like minor tooling tasks. We use mainly containers, ECS. We have about 25 microservices that are running in ECS at the moment. I don't know which side I will be fighting for, though. I'm confused.
Hi, I'm Sebastian Goasguen. I'm an infrastructure systems guy. I worked a long time on virtual machines and then containers. I do a lot of work in Kubernetes these days. And I was very intrigued by serverless. So back in December, I started a POC to demonstrate that we could build a serverless framework on top of Kubernetes. It's called Kubeless. And we now have a serverless plugin, so you can check it out. It's getting quite good. So, I'm just marrying the two, implementing serverless in containers.
So this is my question. This is the first question, and then after that, hopefully, we'll open it out to the audience. Now, it seems like Kassandra and Anna are both fairly expert on this subject, so I think this should work out quite well. Tooling. So at this stage, both serverless and containers are quite new technologies. How do people feel the tooling lives up? Is it production ready? What are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of the two options? Do you want to start?
Sure. One of the main issues with serverless tooling is there's very little in the way of local debugging. With the serverless framework, you can invoke functions locally, but basically we've gone back to the days of console.log with a lot of the way we run debug our serverless applications. And someone mentioned earlier, you basically have to pay the provider twice because you need a dev environment and a production environment, and that's true. Some providers are getting a little bit better about aiming towards developers. Microsoft's Azure Functions, for instance, have really stepped up their developer tools game and have really made some interesting strides. Amazon came out with X-Ray recently, which helps a little bit with debugging. But I do believe the tooling for debugging, at least, is behind on serverless than it is on containers, at least a little bit. It's just enough to be perceptible. But that's just where I'm at that.
I think it really depends on the provider. Like in terms of debugging, for example, Google Functions have pretty much the same as Chrome debugger. You can debug Node functions in the same way. So I think it depends on the provider, what tooling they provide. My biggest problem at the moment is still deployment, because we simply cannot afford to use CloudFormation on the scale of Pizzahut. We have to have a plan, like a Terraform plan. We need to be able to test it in advance before we roll it out. So at the moment, we don't know of a tool that would allow us to use this on the scale that we need.
Sure, I think it's still a very new technology. I was very happy to hear about all the lightning talks, because we actually saw use cases. But I do think it's still a very young technology, so the tooling is probably not up to par. I mean, we heard like CloudWatch is crap, and then security. I mean, guys showed us Sneak, but it's probably just the beginning. So the tooling is only gonna get better, and it's probably very limited now, but we'll see it happening. I mean, in the container world, I mean, the tooling has exploded. Right? Docker has done an amazing job. Kubernetes has done a really good job as well. And then around that, the ecosystem forms, and we see a lot of tooling showing up for security, networking, debugging, everything. And I think we'll see the same thing with serverless. So in a year from now, we'll have very good tooling.
So I see a few different things. A lot of the stuff that Ben showed is deployed with the serverless framework and Circle CI. I think he mentioned that. So it's really quite simplistic. On the other hand, I see a lot of people who are using containers who tend to have to write their own boilerplate deployment code, which for me is non-differential engineering.
That's a good point. Thanks very much for that, everybody. That was very good. So because we're running a little bit short, I think we're going to try and keep up the 5 o'clock. So rather than ask any more questions, unless nobody else in the audience has one, does anybody in the audience have a question that comes out of what they've heard today, or maybe a question that you came into the conference with that hasn't been answered anywhere else? Oh, thank you very much. Question for over there.
Hey, so we talked a lot about the cost model and how, and I can see that at huge scale, obviously serverless is massively cheaper. Let's say, just for theoretical sake, because you could argue it either way, that bunging your app in a container is kind of a bit easier. Right? If you did that, actually, the cost of compute at small to medium scale is so negligible compared to the salary of a developer or an architect or something. You'd have a hard case arguing that you should do serverless. I don't know. I mean, I'd love to know if anyone's seen any good cost comparisons done or great blogs written about it. I haven't had too much of a look myself, but I was thinking about it a lot today. So.
That's a very good question, actually. Excellent.
So this actually doesn't come from me. It comes from this guy from Nordstrom that I met half a year ago. And they said they are running some of their services in Lambdas, and they have this amazing system of spinning up Lambdas as they need so that they don't have cold starts, etc. But he said that if you're not careful, you can really ramp up the costs so much. It's the same thing with like read and writes to DynamoDB. So you really need to be careful. And I think it comes to a point where if you don't have peaks, if you have simply steady use of serverless, it will probably become more expensive than if you run it in containers. So I think it really depends on what exactly you do with it.
To your point about developer cost, I think anything that a developer doesn't do makes it cheaper. So in terms of serverless, for me, it's much simpler, albeit there are some issues around debugging, things like that. So that can often be cheaper from that point of view. You have to accept lots of constraints, I admit that. Another thing is that in many organizations that I've looked at, and certainly our own, I do see some pretty chunky container stacks being deployed that end up not being cheap over time. So although your developer might be expensive in London or wherever in the world, if something's going to run for several years at a appreciable scale and have a development environment, have an integration environment, have a live environment, they're all scaled the same way because that makes life easy, you can run up some pretty big bills that way as well.
Do you have it?
He also kind of touched on this. The other side of the coin to what a developer doesn't do is cheaper is when you don't have to focus on building your own infrastructure and you don't have to focus on things like that, you can get more done that makes your app distinguishable from everything else. For instance, if you're a startup, you in order to even raise money, you have to basically prove that your app has distinguishable value from others in the market. If you're busy worrying about the container stack that you're building, you might be missing a feature that you could be building instead. So that's the converse to what a developer isn't doing, doesn't cost any money. What money are you losing by having your developers focus on something else if you can accept the constraints of serverless and kind of take that burden off of your development team, especially when it's a small development team and you don't have all the resources to spread around.
Actually, I think I'm going to talk about something else because I don't have good data to talk about the pricing. But I think the debate of the panel of serverless versus containers, I don't really, I don't see it that way. I don't see that it's two different technologies that are going to fight against each other. So Kubeless, what we did, we actually implemented serverless using containers. Docker, as they have a solution with Alex. It's serverless using Docker containers. And at the end, there is a server, there is a process running that needs to run somewhere. Containers provide some type of isolation for those processes. So, I don't see why we're, trying to put one against the other. It's really a different way of deploying source, and with serverless, we are not, it feels like we're not building. We're not building binaries. We are just, pushing live code. So the experience is totally different, and we have this feeling that things are going extremely fast, and we forget about containers, we forget about Kubernetes, we just say, hey, deploy my function. So it's more of the user experience that's different. What's underneath, we don't really care.
Just 2 seconds, I'll just add a counter serverless example around debugging and logging. Someone who will remain nameless at an organization that I might be involved with put some code live that had lots of statements in it so they could work out what was wrong with it. They put it in a high trafficked place, and 7 terabytes of CloudWatch logs does get reasonably expensive if you leave it on.
My opinion on that one would be, actually, I've just closed down a lovely startup that was all about selling people ways of cutting their hosting bills. But as it turns out, nobody gives a toss about that. They only care about developer productivity. And I was at the HashiCorp European conference last year. And Mitchell Hashimoto, the CEO, gave his keynote at the start, and he said, right now, people are worried about developer productivity. They are not worried about their hosting bills. They're not worried about how much it costs. And that was also my experience as well. So right now, it's all about feature velocity. It's all about how quickly you can get function out there, how much you can get out of each developer. So yeah, you're right, there's not a huge demand for the money saving, even though serverless may or may not be more expensive. Actually, it's not really where people are making their decision. I don't think it's more about developer productivity. So does anybody have any other questions? That was a very good question, thank you. No questions at all? Question at the back.
So I had a question about something that I haven't seen us touch on yet, or maybe I've been in the wrong place. But so writing small functions and uploading them to like one environment that serves traffic, internal, external, that's fine. But can some of the panelists talk about their experiences in taking in writing a Lambda function and shipping it into an environment where it's obviously playing a downstream dependency on app servers, and taking that through multiple environments, dev, staging, and production, and also like what they use to get different config variables required in those environments into the Lambda function somehow.
Anybody want to take?
We have lots of environments that are like that. There is a challenge in that not all the teams have the same number of environments, so many people point their development applications at other people's production. That sometimes causes challenges. But conversely, some environments, like Ben's example, they have a non-production environment for their stuff, but it's quite small and it's only really there for some sorts of testing because they're really into variant testing and canaries and things like that. The pattern that I see most people use in terms of differentiating traffic is environment variables and using different host names for endpoints, and that seems to work okay from what I can see.
Oh, you'll go after me. So I think that serverless, generally speaking, sort of finishes the agile process of removing a lot of things. Maybe not agile, but lean, making it as lean as humanly possible. So we originally tried to do serverless with dev and testing and production environments, but that just became total mess very quickly. If you have 6 devs working on something, and they spin up serverless environments like that, and it's not long-term affordable. So what we figured out is don't have environments, don't have that many environments. We completely streamlined everything from dev, where you run it locally, to production and using feature flags to make sure that the new code gets tested only under a certain header. And I feel that works actually really well. I know that a lot of people would go probably like, what? But it's quite a good process for us, I think. In terms of variables, just, I don't know, use serverless framework.
Great, thanks. That was a very good question. Anybody else? You've got literally 3 minutes. So this is really your last chance to ask that burning question that comes out of Actually, go on. You just take that.
I just had a short question around how you handle authentication. What are the different ways of doing that to make sure that it's not random people calling your Lambda functions?
Yeah, we use IAM, and just it can get complicated, but it's worth the extra time to just go through and make sure all your IAM rules are set straight, and making sure that the integrated authentication is set. Yes, it's complicated, but it's complicated for a reason. So that's what I'd recommend if you're dealing with Lambda. And Microsoft has built-in authentication functions, if I remember correctly, as well. And yeah, they're complicated, but it's for a very good reason, and it's worth the extra time to go through and make sure that everything's set correctly in terms of authentication and that level of security.
Bar IAM, we use API gateway and API keys or other variants of that. You need to do that because you will find one day someone's calling your stuff and you don't really want them to, and you need to find a way of switching that off. So earlier at lunchtime, someone was talking about connecting directly to DynamoDB. I'm not sure how they're going to stop that example. And once the keys are out there, how do you revoke them without switching it all off? They'll have that problem.
So we're not using AWS Lambda, so we have basically an on-prem solution on top of Kubernetes. So that's a really big question for us. How do we make that happen? So there is a very good story for managing access control for who is actually running the actual function, the process underneath. And there we can use the role-based access control and the namespace isolation of Kubernetes. So there's a very good story there. Now to actually have some type of identity, access management for calling the functions, that's a different story. Right now we don't have a YAM solution on top of that. We're experimenting with Auth0, figuring out how we could actually directly inject Auth0 inside our runtimes to be able to provide that layer. It's still in experimentation. And then Google released a new project called Istio for service mesh. That was a couple of weeks ago, and it could be something that allows us to give some type of authentication authorization of the actual microservices directly. But yes, very, very good question, and we're not there yet. OpenWhisk does it. It would be interesting to see how OpenWhisk does it. I don't think there is any authentication at that level.
Anyone know the answer to that question? OpenWhisk authentication? Nobody's leaping to their feet to, ah. Do you want to re-ask your question?
To paraphrase the question, I think is, in OpenWhisk, do you have any way to do authentication, authorization of calling the functions? Who is calling the functions?
So with OpenWhisk, the whole platform has a REST API, which you have credentials to be able to call, from your IAM or something. And then you could obviously, to call those from external API, you add on the API gateway to kind of hold that. Is that what you mean, or are you talking about more granular access control for your functions?
Excellent. Well, thank you again. There was another excellent question. So we've had 3 very good questions from the audience. I've already said that was the last one, so I guess I should hand over.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was brilliant. Let's give them all a round of applause. Huh? Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to... I'm not quite sure why they were sitting here, but that's okay.